I want to thank you here for getting us to that Alliance meeting. It was really interesting to meet so many people down in Washington recently and learn more about this public access. Anyway, thanks for getting me down there.
Maybe you should describe what the Alliance is.
I'm all for it, but let me introduce you first. And welcome very much to Conversation. We're honored to welcome to the program George Stoney. And George Stoney is billed on his card, professor of film at the New York University Tisch School of the Arts. He's been there a long time. I can remember he was involved with the Alternative Media Center back in some decades back, along with Red Burns. He's a pioneer in the development of public access cable television and communication, and it's an honor. And he got me to make sure I got down to a recent meeting of the Alliance for Community Media, a collection of people concerned with public access across the country that convened a couple of weeks ago in Washington. I was thanking him for that, and I thank you for such a very well-led life, if I may.
Thank you.
Please share, because I've been reading over a lot recently about public access. I'm very interested in it as a phenomena. And as I understand from a lot of the literature I was reading last night, and you'd be familiar with it having been there at the beginning, a lot was going on in Canada before it developed here. I think you were involved in some of that. Maybe you could share a little of your own background, where you're from originally, and then the beginnings of public access that seem to have roots in Canada, if I'm reading the record right.
Well, I was very fortunate to be invited to Canada. I had been a producer of sponsored films, mostly for government agencies and nonprofit agencies for some time.
All My Babies would have been one of those?
That was one of many.
Okay. Yeah.
This was in the late 40s and 50s and 60s. And the Canadian government had started a program called Challenge for Change.
Right.
The idea was that they made films to help create a dialogue between the government agencies and the people they serve, a dialogue between those people. And the film was an agent for that dialogue.
Very good.
Well, most of the filmmakers at the Film Board were recruited on the basis of making their own documentaries. And they weren't too happy with working with government agencies. Sponsored films, they say.
Yeah.
And so, fortunately, an old student of mine who was in Canada and working at the Film Board suggested that they invite me up for a while.
Okay.
Because I had made sponsored films very much like the ones that they were being asked to make.
Right. Okay.
And so I'd known the Film Board for a long time because I started film in 1948 at a little film unit in Athens, Georgia. It was headed by Nick Reed, an old college friend from Alabama, the University of North Carolina, who had worked at the Film Board for 4 years during the war.
Okay.
And he hired me as a scriptwriter because I'd worked for the Farm Security Administration, and he had contracts with agricultural agencies. And I said, well, I don't know anything about movies. He said, don't worry. We will bring people down from the Film Board to train you. So I met a number of the people from the Film Board. So I was a known quality in Ottawa at that time.
That's where it was based, the Film Board?
That's right.
Yeah, okay.
And I was so lucky to be at the center of the greatest documentary center in the world.
It really is. The work they do, it continues. I think the Canadian Film Board.
I used, in my classes at NYU, I used many films coming from the Film Board even now. Well, there we were looking for ways of getting our films out to people, familiarizing the communities with them, and we found that cable television was coming into many places in Canada.
What year are we talking
We're talking about 1970.
70. It seemed to be that was about the beginning of things. Cable was just starting to build out.
68 to 70 is when I was in Canada.
Okay, you were right at the birth of the whole thing.
And many of the towns were putting in cable because they needed the high antennas to bring in particularly the U.S. stations.
Yes, indeed.
And that was why people would subscribe. But they also had these extra channels that weren't being used. Many of the stations tried to drum up a little business for themselves by having the old 1-inch tape recorders and doing advertising with our local shows, but they weren't doing it very well. And we persuaded them to let us start using those channels to get our stuff out.
Okay, what were you producing in? What was the film? It was film.
Yes,
16 millimeter steam back.
It was almost all 16 millimeter films, though we also invested in half-inch video.
That was just coming in. That would be like the Portapack.
That's right. And VCR Saint-Jacques, the first film that introduced, would show you how we introduced the half-inch tape. The idea was, and these ideologues at the film board had this, was that this would make it possible for people to make their own television shows.
Amen, yes.
And it would be cheaper than using film and simpler than using film.
Was that quality, that Portapack stuff, was that up to steam in terms of its quality and so forth?
Well, it was.
There were some limitations, but it was a start, right?
It was a start. It said, I think, about 40 lines compared with the regular videos, many regular films, many lines. And in fact, when we first wanted to persuade the FCC to let us put half-inch on cable in this country, they had a standard, and they said, no, it's below the standard. And we were able to demonstrate that when it went out on the wire, it would hold up.
I remember Michael Schamberg. Did you know Michael Schamberg at Rain Dance, and Paul Ryan and Barrow? And Michael Schamberg did a thing with Guru Maharaji or something, and he put it up deliberately on the satellite to deliver it by satellite that it could work. And it was black and white, I think, done with a Portapack. But he did it just to show that it could be done.
Because all of this was black and white.
Yeah, right. It was all black and white.
But the idea, the deep idea, was to help people speak for themselves.
Right, right. It's called democracy.
That was the basic idea.
Yeah, right, yeah.
And we developed all of these access ideas came from that basic idea.
Okay, I wonder
if people could speak for themselves.
Right, right. That's really good. And that you were doing that work with the you know, that you did it back in North Carolina too, I think, some, right? You were doing that kind of work, All My Babies, these kind of things, part of a government
that
thing.
Was earlier.
That was earlier, but leading up to it.
But those were our films even then were made to try to give ordinary people a voice.
Yeah, that's what that's what we're about, really, is trying to expand the possibility of the democratization of communication in a multimedia form, and that's a really leading edge question we have now. I wonder if I could ask you something else. There was a group along about 1970, you were on the scene, and you had Sidney Dean was a friend of yours, and Eugenia and so forth, and there were some others, Everett Parker, there were others, but you were there. And there was a commission report. There was a thing called the Sloan Commission on cable television. They said, cable television, the medium of abundance. It was subtitled. Were you aware of that? And was that an important document in terms of laying the groundwork?
Document. Yes, it spoke for us all.
It did. You want to address it a little bit? Who was involved in that, or as you remember? And what did it have to say about the future of communications that was relevant to what actually emerged?
Well, the assumption was that the airways belonged to the public.
Okay.
And that the industry only was having certain sections of that to serve the public.
Yeah.
And so we thought that in exchange for its use of the airways, it owed the public a spectrum.
Okay.
That's when
and payback.
That was the basis for public television. But public television very quickly became a place where programs were made for the public, not with the public.
Or by the public. Do you think that principle that they belong to the airways had been contained in the Communications Act of 1934, that it set the policy grounding statements on communication prior to when when cable television was actually even being introduced? That principle of public ownership.
I think that your observation is dead right, because it did anticipate that there was some payback, some access that the public should have. It wasn't explicit.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
But it was there. You're right. It was there right from the beginning.
Well, I can remember, if I could, Joe, I appreciate going over this with you, because I was doing some things then, having been a professor, and then going out and doing some programming. But I wasn't paying very much attention to the institutional frameworks by which things are going on. I was just busy doing programs and so forth. And I can remember that Sloan Commission report, and it was a thing that was of very interest to me, that they were coming along, and you could make programs, and it made it available because there was a new, the medium of abundance was the subtitle of that we were going to have many channel capacity. There was going to be a new abundant capacity, and that seems to me to be something that's still going on as we begin to get along with our friends and open source people within the internet and so forth. But the idea of an abundant capability as opposed to a limited or scarce capability to produce product and so forth was part of the change that was going on. No?
That's true.
Yeah.
And now we are ready for the biggest change now, which I see.
Yeah.
Before, it was assumed that if the ordinary person had a chance to speak and to communicate his or her ideas, that was enough. We know now that that only gets you so far. You see, people are communicating on their cell phones, they're communicating on but when does action happen?
Right.
Action happens when they get together as a result of that. Now, we were way ahead of that in Challenge for Change, because most of our films were made not just to be broadcast, but to be shown in public meetings.
That could make a change.
That could make a change.
Right.
And I'm very pleased to say that all around the country now, and you got it in that meeting in Washington, all around the country, access centers are becoming more and more not just places where programming is made by producers, but where people are meeting to talk and to take action on public topics.
There was one item you had in there and it was a town in early, 68 or something. They got together and started talking that they needed a traffic light, and it actually got the traffic light in place. And it came as a result of the media, so it affected the reality rather than just an abstract principle or abstract idea,
It's not as just remember T.S. Eliot said, just connect, but that isn't enough. Connection doesn't make action. And I've always focused on the next action.
Yeah, right. Well, that's part of what's going on. Well, I was doing programming. I used to do programming with for communications. I went down and did, Richard Wiley was their chairman of the community, and I would do a lot of programs, but I didn't realize what was going on in terms of, because I would just take them to the Time Warner or Sterling Manhattan or teleprompter, turn them in and play them. But there was all this institutional framework being built, and that's something that's of great interest to me, and I think it might be shared with the wider audience, that we have a unique we have a unique thing emerging, if I may, with, well, I think of Sidney Dean and some others, you and others, but there were representatives of the civil society, which in a certain sense stood outside of the normal power and influence relationship of the society of the corporate, private sector, profit making, and then you have what we call the government, which can tax and spend and regulate, and then there were people coming out of the civil society that had a major influence in terms of setting the structure around 1970, that time there was a great deal going on, and they set aside and had the cable companies agree to set aside income from what would be otherwise their retained earnings, the corporations that would get allotted the franchise agreement, which was, as Lord Beaverbrook in England said, a license to print money. They were going to make serious money by taking this in. So there was a great deal of competition that they were going to set aside some for public, educational, and governmental considerations, and that was negotiated. And that idea that, that was able to become established and seeming accepted law by the cable industry and the people that are concerned with communications seems to me totally unique, because it gets serious money from their otherwise retained earnings to the entities that set up, like ours, Manhattan Network and others across the country, to set up a reasonably competitive playing field for the people, which is sort of unique in terms of the history of communications. No one else has had to do that. Nor Mr. Paley had no such obligation, or Mr. Gates has no such obligation.
I think we should advise viewers,
yes, please,
that they should look at their cable bill,
okay,
and they will see that the money that is given to the city for regulation and for public access is added in addition to the other fees. So it's clear on the bill itself that it's not coming out of the cable company's good heart, but it's coming out of their backs. So
well, yes, sir, but I do recognize also that all the income coming to them comes out of the monies that they get by charging people for the product that they deliver.
That's right.
So that's part of their earnings.
Right.
And they set aside, like Mr. Paley again, when he set up CBS, had no obligation to have equipment capability for the people to produce television, rather than the professionals within the industry or the products that are offered in the market to the general society. And as I said to you in a conversation, I mean, just before we started, and you know, the steel industry has no such obligation, the automobile industry has none such, or any of the other aspects of the operation of the economy, with the exception of public access cable television. And it makes it very unique in the fact that that was able to assert itself, and you and Mr. Parker and Mr. Dean and so forth were instrumental in bringing that little window of capability for something to get to the people, rather than having it go through the normal dialectic of private sector, government sector,
and
relationship of power and
influence.
we're
having to fight very hard to hold on to it.
But that it got established is like a minor miracle, and there was something that made that possible.
Okay, but what's happened recently?
Yes, sir.
14 states. In 14 states, the legislatures have passed regulations that require the cable companies to have statewide franchises, not local franchises.
Okay.
And it's much easier for the lobbyists to get to the state's houses instead of each individual city. And so as a result of that, many of the access centers around the country have had their money cut back considerably.
Okay, we want to go into some detail, the process by which that happens, so that it might be avoided by our responsible citizenry that are viewing this program, because that's not a good tendency.
All we can do is to have them stay in touch with their state legislatures and make sure that this doesn't happen in their states.
Was there not reaction at the beginning? We're talking at the beginning of public access as an institution, and now we've got 3,000, if I'm not mistaken, entities across the United States.
Many entities across the country.
I don't know how many of them are supported significantly by this franchise agreement with the cable industry leaders and so forth. But was there objection to the idea that they were going to have to set aside, they're going to build out their system, they were going to have to set aside earnings for providing facilities, not so much educational in the government, that fits in the traditional pattern of influence and power in an area, but the public. For the public, they were going to have to. Was there objection to that by the people who were getting the initial franchises let? Or what was the context of thinking in that?
Well, remember that there was a competition for the franchise in each place.
Okay.
And the people who wanted the franchise would promise you everything.
That's because they wanted that license to print money.
And they promised to plant trees, they promised to support the NAACP.
There'll be swings
all
for the kiddies.
Kind of things to get that franchise.
Yeah, it was a valuable thing. Yeah.
And so that's why the cities made bargains with them. And before long, we and the access movement were training cities to insist in their franchising, to demand this. Now, at first, it was all public channels. It wasn't public, educational, and government access.
I see, okay.
And then somebody dreamed up the idea of PEG, public, educational, public. And I was a bit uncomfortable with that.
Okay.
Because I said, when the fight is over, there's going to be a fight over money.
Okay, sure.
And the government's going to get the first dib.
Yeah, they're going to go
and
first.
And then the school board is going to, and we'll come last.
Yeah.
Even more worrying to me is if the government is running government access, it'll be a mouthpiece for City Hall.
Yeah, that's
sort of a place where people can exchange views.
Right, yeah.
If it's educational access, then it's a mouthpiece for the superintendent of the school and the school board.
Or the universities,
instead
even, maybe.
of exchanges.
Okay.
And the public will came last. And that did happen in many places.
Okay.
I'm very pleased to say that some places, and so I think some of the best access centers I know, all three come out of the same place.
Okay.
Because the idea that this is a place where people exchange.
Yeah.
So you say
the people matter in terms of what actually happens.
Larchmont Mamaroneck, the educational channel there, is a beautiful example of where the people exchange with the school board. Every teacher every new teacher gets a program. The students are making programs for that channel. It's an ideal arrangement. And it's an ideal carrying out of an arrangement in that particular place. And there are many examples around the country.
Yeah, I think there are. When you got 3,000, there's got to be some good, and then some. Some are still mom and pop. I mean, they don't have this arrangement. I'm just wondering, because it seems as I read it, and I didn't realize, you're reading the Communications Act of 72 and then 76 and 79, there were developments changing, and the FCC had a role in that, and there was a developing, they set a standard of over 3,500 subscribers had to allow for this. There was all this developing and so forth. But if you look at that, there would have been. Were there any representatives? Ivan Karp? No, Irving Kahn. Irving Kahn was the head. I remember Irving Kahn. We did, and he was. But were there people who said, we don't want to have to take money to set up something for something so abstract or, hard to define as the people? Where's the accountability going to be? You got the whole of the people of Manhattan, let's say, that you're going to be responsible. That's obviously unworkable. It doesn't work. There weren't entities to give accountability. Were there people who were saying, we don't want to have that be something that we're going to have to take our earnings, we're going to have a hard time having capital formation to build out these very expensive systems? That kind of an argument coming from the industry people.
Many places didn't have public access.
Right.
Or decided not to exercise the franchise that was written in, that was written into the franchise.
Okay.
And but as I think actually the government access helped us there.
Okay.
Because people in one county would see how it made public issues public.
Right.
And also they realized it almost always benefited the incumbent, because the incumbent was on the camera.
I'm shocked. Yes, it was seen as a platform, right? Yeah, like I can remember talking to a young man. I went down there when they had remember Telstar came?
Yeah.
And I was doing programs, and I wasn't paying attention to the institutional stuff. I've lately been really turning my attention to it. But I remember doing a couple. One was a man named Gerald Levin, and he was the head of home box office. Happy as a lark, they had just been able to link up with Telstar, the home box office across the country. They used to have to ship 2-inch high beam tapes. They're like 35 millimeter to each head end across the country. But the other one was I went to Washington, and I was saying, well, we got all the Sloan Commission says we got all kinds of capacity. Now maybe we can put up our intellectual leadership on the channel that would go across the country. And I had a gentleman I was talking to, we were warming our hands over entrepreneurial coffee, and he said, well, that's a good idea, Harold, but he said, I'm thinking of starting a television channel that will bring the House of Representatives. What do you think, Harold? We had an envelope and a pencil, and he says, it's going to be cable, and he says, Dad, and it's going to be delivered by satellite, and it's going to be public affairs, and it's going to be a network, and that was Brian Lamb talking about starting the C-SPAN.
C-SPAN.
C-SPAN is the jewel in the crown in many people's idea for the whole cable industry. And don't you think the cable industry might be able to see or get through beyond the regulations and the requirements? He's very much in favor of the public access. Ted Turner likes it, I know, as another personality that was part of the thing. But the public relations benefit of the existence of something so democratic as public access could be something that from a public relations standpoint could be very, very beneficial to the major players, don't you think? Well, or what do they, for public relations?
It's always baffled me that there is as much opposition to access in the cable industry as there is, because it increases subscribership.
Sure it does, yeah.
Even if there are just a few people added, it's all clear profit. Any new subscriber, and you take the school board putting on new teachers, maybe that would get 5 subscribers this week and 10, but it's always baffled me why there is even a vestigial opposition to access on cable.
Thank you for that. I am surprised in a certain sense, I thought about it, there wouldn't have been more opposition from the cable people who would be claiming we need to accumulate that profit margin to cost of we're going to lay out this cable at high cost and we're bringing all these, and it doesn't apply to any other aspect of the society. I mean, it seems to be very unique, and they would be able to make the normal arguments. I can see where a number of people would make that argument, and yet it seems to be accepted across the country that the cable companies, now Verizon's coming in with Philos and all that, and that they accept this idea that they're going to be a franchising process with the mayor's office or whatever, the local, and that there will be these serious amounts of money set aside for providing for the public access, that it was sort of an accepted law and not constitutionally challenged and so forth by people, industry leaders, who wanted to retain all those earnings for their own investment, feasibility worked out studies and so forth.
But you're leaving one big shift.
Well, yes, sir.
You see, when public access first came in, when it was franchised on a large scale, the cable companies ran public access. When it came into Manhattan, the cable company itself had its own studio.
That would be Sterling Manhattan.
And it ran the studio. And you had to go and get their permissions and so forth and so on. It was only when New York decided a nonprofit should take it over. Now, this was not happening in many places in the country for a long time, and in many places, cable companies still run access.
They used to have a place up on 125 Street in Manhattan.
Yes, that's right.
Back in the early 70s.
That's right.
Was that being run by a teleprompter?
Yes. I remember I was doing a kind of debate with the cable person at a forum, and he says, but you just can't let people put on anything. I said, what do you mean? He says, we've got a contract with this local housing project, and they put on a program. And the other day, they were doing a thing on birth control. And they were talking about devices, and they were demonstrating.
Yeah, well, that's at a level that you're always got that level of thing about obscenity and that kind of stuff. But just the business thing. But that it does seem to be accepted by the cable industry people by and large. There's conflict there. Some people do, but it seems to have been accepted where they accept this responsibility. But what I was suggesting, they might be able to accept that favorably, particularly if there is a drift toward what we call real democracy, being a packageable PR issue as the society evolves, that it could be part of the jewel in the crown of the cable industry that they do this as a public relations
thing.
thing.
Many things were eased up when they had many more channels. Technology allowed them to have many more channels.
And that's a trend that's continuing.
That's right.
Yes.
So that before, those channels, those extra channels, they could sell to people. Now they can still sell channels to people and still have these extra channels.
Yeah, well, that gives them what they'd say in Brooklyn,
That's
vigorish,
right.
or wiggle room,
Yes.
or doing things.
So that, but I think it's an emotional thing.
Yeah, okay.
The businessmen don't like to have people fooling with their stuff.
With their earnings.
Well, their channels.
Oh, their channels. Okay, yeah, right.
It's taken a long time to educate them, I think. But we haven't had those battles in a long time. But what we do have is these battles in the state legislatures.
Yes, you spoke about that, 14 states where they've gone on this, and there will be elements within that, let's say the business realm, that would just as soon not have to bother with all of this business of setting aside money from their earnings to deal with this, and they would like to do away with it. I don't know if there was part of that in the Communications Act in '96 or not, but and this is a problem where they take it to the state level, and this is something we should keep an eye on.
Yes.
And the citizenry should keep an eye on that, because the idea of the democracy of people being able to communicate is really a very important principle, and one that tracks well the capability for advanced communication coming out of all the cyber stuff now.
The best thing public access does is to inform local people about local things.
Right.
And when it's moved from the city responsibility to the state responsibility, it's much easier for the lobbyists, for the industry to get at the state legislators.
I see. What causes that shift to happen, to go from the local to the state? That gives the lobbyists a better advantage?
It gives the cable company a better chance to cut back on its obligations.
If that's their intention.
That's right.
Are there many people in the cable industry that celebrate the idea of public access? Do you, the Cable Television Association meetings?
I'm not so aware of them now. I was, by the way, when we first started the Alternate Media Center.
Yes.
And showed people how to set up public access centers.
Yeah.
Because a young fellow who was a PR person for the cable industry helped me set up the program.
Okay.
The Markle Foundation gave us some money at the NYU's Alternate Media Center to set up some demonstration access centers around the country. But that meant we had to find cable operators who would do this.
Okay.
And we were able to find, and Red Branch was particularly good at this, we were able to find a number of cable operators who saw that as their advantage.
Okay.
And to be a qualified intern, you had to find a cable operator who would agree to let you use a channel.
Okay, sure.
And pay half your salary.
Okay.
And
they had to do that? There wasn't enough there from the Merkle or anything?
You weren't a viable candidate for an internship unless you did that.
Okay.
Well, that cut it down from several hundred applicants to the hustlers.
Yeah, right.
Which was needed.
Well, sometimes hustlers help,
Absolutely.
Yeah, right.
And some of those people who came on in the first year are still active.
Yeah,
and you
good.
met some of the best of them in Washington just a few weeks ago.
At the Alliance,
Well, they... what that did was to mean that they were welcome in the building. They had access to the channels, and we didn't have to peddle them to the access centers.
Yeah.
And they had, in effect, a half-time employee.
Okay. Yeah.
Because they were doing their own what's called lease access.
Right.
Which they could use some of them for that.
Right.
It was only later that we got the idea that the access center should be independent agencies.
Okay.
And I was delighted when the New York City decided that we should move from cable access here run by the cable company to a nonprofit agency.
When was that done? When was that?
I can't remember exactly the year. I think it was 87 or 88. I'm not sure.
There. Yeah, right.
But that made it a whale of a big difference. And that's when we set up Manhattan Neighborhood Network.
Yeah.
And the other access centers around the around the city.
Yeah. You have to have some sort of accountability too. You have to have if they're putting that money out, then there would want to be some accountability for it. But it also has a political component. So you have public support, or let's say city council members and political support for this idea. And it seems to me like a really good, I think democracy is a good idea. And the idea that you have something that is democratic, whereas the other things are all controlled by the pros or the people that have a vested interest in it, is such a good idea who's timely, that there should be general support among the general citizenry. Maybe no involvement with it directly at all. Good if they can come, let's say, here to become a producer or something, but that the idea should be one that would resonate in many people's consciousness as a good thing.
But we have learned that one of the jobs of the Access Center is to make sure that a few people don't dominate their airways.
Thank you. Okay.
One of the
now who's making sure of this? Who's watching that chicken coop?
We have to make sure that this happens. In every case, and you've seen some places where this is not happening.
You mean the operation of an access center?
Yes.
It could be taken over by some politically connected group or something and not be operating democratic at all. And that's got to be some accountability there by us or by the people who are interested in the democratic principle, apart from only just some business model.
You see, this is one of the reasons why at the Alternate Media Center we set up these access centers. And we developed a kind of philosophy that's grown and grown and grown since the early 70s, and we set up the National Cable Television, the Alliance for Community Media. Started out to be the what was it, NFLCP.
That's right. You had an early. I remember being at an early meeting up in Boston. There was one in Boston way the heck back, and you were involved in getting that started. That was a good idea.
And because we set up a kind of philosophical framework.
It's important. The principles that are involved in this are very important. Go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt. Yeah. And you did. You set that up, and that does that. That idea of operating them and keeping track and on them is really very important. And that was the alliance that the meeting had just a couple weeks ago in Washington. Still going on. Do you think the thing is in place? So you would guard against a group taking over an access center, like at the level of the board of directors? Is that possible? That there is people just taking over, setting policy?
It can happen, of course.
Are there methods that the alliance can exert, good practices, principles that guards against, or at least puts a spotlight when somebody gets out, and the founding principles, bylaws, mission, and all that sort of thing is pretty well understood in this democratic mode of what you're encouraging, so that if somebody goes off the ranch, as they say, you could put a spotlight on it as a group?
We have model procedures, we have model setups, all of that. That's one of the jobs of the alliance.
And that's a good. And then also to put some connection to the public and garnering and keeping the public support for the institutional, for the institution itself of public access. Very important.
Right at the beginning, we were afraid that a few people would dominate, so we said first come, first served, non-discriminatory access with no prior review of programming, so there wouldn't be censorship. Those were the rules we set up. And we found that all of those are fallible to some extent.
Right, it's hard,
first come, first serve. It could easily be the most Johnny on the spot. Because the eager ones the better trained ones,
right.
the people who have more spare time,
Right.
so forth,
Yeah.
if you're not careful.
Yeah.
Access centers have an obligation, and this is
Yes.
this is my saying.
Fair enough, yeah.
Access centers have an obligation to do their best to have the parts of the population that isn't seen on their channels to speak.
Yeah, the people.
That's right. But who are the people?
Well, that's a big question.
Each person has his own definition of that.
That's right.
But this is asking a lot of an access center
Sure is.
administrator. But I think that's what we need to do.
Yeah, it's called democracy.
Yeah. Well,
no, in a very real sense, serious.
Yes.
It is in a way, because one of the things is, like, the industry is looking for a star. If you're in CBS or something, you want a star, a Carol Barnett or somebody who's going to get eyeballs to get advertised. But here you can have the junior high school pageant or something that is not going to be a star. It's the real people, and that's a democratic representation. And that there's an ability, we have hundreds or even thousands of people that can participate and have a say here of people that aren't stars. Not everybody's a Tiger Woods. And there is a democratic component to communication that's important, and this is an opening that makes that possible. That's important one of the first principles that's involved, it seems to me. The democratic in the sense of as many of the people in their diversity as possible is here, much more than it is in any of the economic models based upon stardom.
I think that when people say, what's on public access, I says, a wide variety of people. It's much more like riding the subway.
Yes, than the limousine.
The racial mixture, the sex mixture, the age mixture, and so forth.
Yeah.
But that does not happen without effort on the part of the staff.
Yeah.
Look at the effort we put in at Manhattan Neighborhood Network, put into the youth channel, for example.
Yeah, yeah, okay.
Look into the efforts we made to get people of other languages using our channels. We use a grants program to encourage other organizations, nonprofit organizations, to learn how to use the channels properly.
Right.
Or effectively.
Or the equipment, even the equipment.
Not properly, but effectively.
Yeah, okay, there's a difference.
All of those come, and that's not built into the franchise.
Right, no.
But there is an ideology, let's say, of public access.
And it is
and that's why I was very pleased that you came to Washington and got a whiff of what we do in the Alliance for Community Media.
Yeah, there are, and that they can have those things. It seems to me they're also, because we're working at our end in terms of setting up a national alliance of producers, because they have an interest in this, and they don't have, too many people think if you're really good, you'll be on NBC or something, or within one of those networks. This is a different proposition. This is a thing for the people, and I think that's really very, very, it seems to me really very important that be there, and that's part of its characteristic. I was trying to think, there was something that I was trying to cue off that. I was thinking the fact that these things do exist. You have these different kinds of, Sidney Dean, this is what I was reaching for. Sidney Dean, I went through a lot of his papers with Eugenia. God bless her, she's lovely, his widow. And he was and he used to use the term, the technological curve, the Sloan Commission, back to one of the grounding statements by a lot of thoughtful people, is that you have cable type, a medium of abundance. You could have many channels, you could have abundance. The abundance is coming through the development, and he said that the capacity should always be more than the demand. And if not, then you have to go to first come, first serve. But if you want to do is expand it. And as I understand some of the cyber fellows in talking, we have 4 channels now here, say at Manhattan Network. They could become 12. And it's bandwidth. And there can be an expansion, so there can be an inclusive pattern of greater numbers of people without diminishing And that seems to be one of the promises of the technologies coming along, like the cavalry over the hill, it seems. And public access was pioneering out there in the 70s, and now it's coming in the computer and the internet and so forth is coming in league with, particularly open source people within that realm, in support of the general theme of letting the people have a real say over things in a way that traditionally and historically they haven't. Does that seem true to you, or where does it fit? And how do we safeguard it?
How do we safeguard it?
Yeah, the whole thing.
I think we have to watch the FCC very carefully.
Well, thank you. Mr. Martin will be going soon.
Two of the 5 commissioners are strong supporters of public access.
Yeah.
3 are not.
Yeah.
And that's why we're beginning to lose ground. And I'm just holding my breath that we don't lose more ground before the new administration.
Yeah.
And I hope to goodness that administration changes so that we can guarantee public access for the next few years.
Does that mean Mr. Martin will be leaving, or the president selects?
Who knows?
Yeah. I used to get along very well with Richard Wiley, and he's still one of the people. He was this. They used to welcome us at the FCC. He was chairman at the time we were talking, and he liked public access.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people who like it very much, and that kind of thing. So in this movement where you have the states going at the state level, this is a dangerous thing where that's happened, and that's under the behest of some people that are not, favorably disposed toward this idea of democratic public access, institutional support.
As I say, the industry is trying to cut down on the support.
Some are.
Yes, the industry
as a whole. You think it is? Okay.
And you see it certainly in the 14 states. It's already done so.
Yeah,
and so we want to fight that.
Okay, that's good. There are some who support it within the industry. Again, back to that thing of public relations. That's important, it seems to me. And it seems to me something that, particularly if the mood is changing or something, I don't know how anybody, a citizen, would be against it unless they had some special dog in that fight, in terms of their immediate special interest or something. But the idea itself is so democratic and so appealing to, just national, the thinking of citizens in general.
You just assume that everybody's for democracy.
Yes, well, I do. No, or the democracy, the movement of things.
Everybody says they're for democracy, but it's my definition or your definition of democracy.
Yeah, I understand that. I understand that. But
coming to a personal question that I've always wanted to ask you.
Oh, yeah.
You have been putting on remarkable programs, interviews with intellectuals for many years.
Since about 1970.
What keeps you going?
Well, I want to change. I think we need to change the world. It has to be fun. I think we're at a very crucial time. I think we have weapon systems that are species lethal. I don't think we have vision in our political or business leadership or intellectual leadership for institutional changes that the future requires. It concerns me. I got 4 grandchildren. And it's just a concern of that. And I think I have some ideas that are relevant to how that could be done that run against the grain. And so it's a sense of purpose and mission and intellectual curiosity and liking people and that sort of thing. But really it's just essentially it's idealistic and very, very driven by a sense that we need a real massive change that this evolution of consciousness calls for.
Well, it takes many citizens with your commitment to make public access work. So I want to commend you for what you've done over the years. Because as maybe the viewers of this program do not know, how many other places carry your programs.
Well, yeah, and now it's expanding. You got the YouTube and that sort of thing. So if you have a sense of now, I may be totally delusional. I mean, it could be that, but I just think there's real honest-to-God democracy may be in the air. I mean, real economic democracy and liberation. I think we live in a system where it's all controlled by a few plutocrats who own the assets, and it's sort of like a feudal estate, the way the world is set up now. You know, a few people own everything and everybody else is locked into their system and are just like serfs on an estate. They just go along with it. And I think we need a massive change, and there's some things blowing in the wind that signal that. And so you just try to find a place where that can be brought out as a way of being a template for suggesting policy directions for the operation of what Bucky Fuller called Spaceship Earth. We're on a spaceship and we need an operating manual. I don't think we have it. And I think we're reaching for it. It's going to come out of public access more than it'll come out of any established media centers, in my view. It's going to come out of the people. And public access is a window that allows that to happen, and may it grow and prosper and everything. And I see positive possibilities for that. And I thank you for the people who are setting that institutional framework for making it. And I think it's very important, the finance. The fact that it's financed that way, and I think that could become, that's like the DNA of communication. Communication is like DNA, and there's 100 trillion cells in a human organism, and they all count. We've got a social organization where only a few count. And that's not good. We need something else better than that, and they're going to have some sort of a qualitative transformation where we'll have the full realization of the full human potential within an ecological context that might then be offsetting the fact that we now have weapon systems that, if they're unleashed within about a half an hour, eliminates the whole species. There's something new blowing in the wind, as they say, and we haven't got vision of that by our so-called leadership, and it'll come out of the mass of the people, in my view. And so for that reason, it's something worth paying attention to. And that's what motivates me. It's just idealism. And,
well, what bothers me as a teacher...
Yes, sir.
I've been teaching at NYU since 1970.
Mm-hmm.
I have students who usually come to us from very good high schools, and I see more and more they're coming with preconceived ideas of the right answer. They get into your class and they want to know, what must I do to get a grade? Not what do I learn in this class? But what is the right answer to get a grade?
Well,
and I think that our whole school system is developing that kind of limited conformity.
I couldn't agree with you more.
And I'm very much concerned that public access do something about this, and I don't know quite how it can do it.
Well, I think it'll become an alternate source. They have a term, autodidact. I used a professor, and I had the same problem. And I've been taught about 6, 7 universities and that kind of thing. But I got kind of radically inclined through Mr. McLuhan and Mr. Fuller and some other things like that. And since you asked me personally, I'm almost pathologically anti-authoritarian. I really dislike authoritarianism. When I was a professor, students would come into the room and they would say to me, okay, we got what do I have to do to be an A, a B, a C, and looking for that outer directed something or other that I just can't abide. So what I did is I used to give everybody an A on the first day. And that was just, I said, okay, you all got your A. Now go away, or you do what you want, and I'll be here every day, and if you want to come, we'll do something. And I'd be there. And then what happened is a lot of people who got their A to get their grade report so they can get into Harvard Business or something, whatever they had. And then what happened is my class just got filled with all the smartest people on the campus. And it was just that it had nothing to do with that authoritarian. I think the school system, by and large, largely is set up to teach people to be bowing down to authority figures, so they'll fit into cubicle corporate America and be good wage slaves that'll sit within the system and not question authority. I think authority should be questioned, and questioned heartily and so forth. And public access is probably the best capability for education and autodidactic, and you don't need listening to somebody who's going to grade you. And what do you need to educational reform, I think, is coming through the media. Why would anybody want to go and sit and listen to somebody, under those kind of think it's narcissism or something, I think, that's loose, and that's not where the answers are going to come from. But I dealt with it by simply doing away with it, but that could not be abided by the administrations.
No, I'm
because
not.
the whole society.
I couldn't get away with that at NYU.
That would undercut. And then I said they should become media centers, the universities, and use put it there as like talent, and they become talent, the professors, and then you set up media centers for getting it out to communicate and to make it available. And it's sort of coming around now because you got the YouTube. And you've got the thing where you can get the best minds, and if you want to know something, you can go to the internet. We had a hard time with the Open University trying to bring them here. Lord Perry, he had the Open University in Britain where they used television to get to the people. We wanted to try and do it here, and the ones who were really objecting to that were the professors. They thought it would undercut their authority if you had the best minds in any discipline because they're operating in order to get a mortgage payment. And all the economics. So we needed new economics and the whole change of the whole system. And so that's what motivates me. And I think television is important. And so that's what's going on now. And I'm trying to get the measure of the beginnings of this unique, particularly the financing, that this thing that they've agreed to setting this up, because I think that might amount to a change in not only over the means of communication, which is like the DNA, but it might lead to where we will have a change in influence over the people, over the means of production, a much larger thing. Because the whole of the economy and the whole of the society is exempt from that claim. It's all plutocratic and owned by a tiny class of people in all the political entities in the world. The capital is not formed in a way, there's no distribution of income by ownership of the assets that are increasingly responsible for production. We need a qualitative transformation. I guess most idealists think that's needed, but it's a synergistic thing. Happy Mr. Fuller just had the, I'm sorry, I just get going. You shouldn't have brought that up. But Buckminster Fuller inspired me, Marshall McLuhan, and a whole lot of other people. But I'm inspired with a sense of purpose, and that helps.
Good.
Yeah. But I'm trying to get it, and I wanted to thank you and Mr. Dean. You knew him well, Sidney Dean?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and he was another one of the major figures.
Interestingly enough.
Who were our founding fathers?
Interestingly enough, Sidney Dean was an executive and an advertising agency.
Yes, indeed, yeah.
He knew the power of the media to sell ideas. But that was not his idea in talking to public access. It was just the reverse of that.
Right.
So I think he should be particularly honored because he knew the power, but he didn't want it to go in the direction that his brothers wanted to go in.
Well, he knew the territory.
Yes.
He knew who was running that chicken
Absolutely.
coop. Yeah.
Yes.
And he said many public access channels, public access channels, public access channels. I think that's what the planet needs is let's hear from the people instead of just the leaders, so-called, in my sense, So I'm glad that he was there and they got that all set up. And you were there and Everett Parker and there were others, and I thank you for all of that. And I thank you for participating. It's a great honor to talk to you, and thank you.
Thank you very much.
Always good to talk to you.
Thank you.
George Stoney, founding father among others, but one of the major founding fathers of public access, the great